this is part 3 of the chapter 2 lecture notes. And this page is just a summary of the octet rule so that you will understand what atoms do in order to become stable. So I'm just, don't always do this, but I'm just going to read these statements. Each energy level or electron shell is complete when it has 8 electrons, and that is where the word octet comes from. But as we talked about before, smaller atoms like hydrogen and helium don't have that many electrons. Hydrogen only has 1 electron, helium only has 2. So their first energy level is complete with only 2 electrons. So the exception to the octet rule is the first energy level. The first energy level is complete with 2 electrons. But the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh energy levels must have 8 electrons to be complete or stable. So atoms are going to react in such a way that their valence shell, which is defined as their outermost energy level, the energy level furthest away from the nucleus, is complete. And in order to complete their outermost energy level, their valence shell, atoms can gain, lose, or share electrons with other atoms. And that will make them stable. So on this page, I just want to skip, actually. I can explain it better with a figure. So in chemistry, you have more of a need to understand electron configurations. In other words, you study more where electrons are located outside the nucleus. In biology, I'm just going to attempt to explain the basics to you. Subshells are not really, they're regions of space that have certain shapes. And those shapes represent the areas where electrons are most likely to be found. And so what that means is, if we can just take this diagram and look at the first subshell, which is the S subshell. The S subshell is spherical. In other words, it's round. Okay? So if this is the nucleus of the atom, the first energy level only has 1 subshell, and it's an S subshell. So I'm going to change the color. We will go with green. So outside the nucleus of this atom that I have drawn, the S subshell would be the space inside of this green sphere. Okay? So what that means is if an electron is not going to orbit around the nucleus like planets orbit the sun. Electrons don't move that way. An electron is going to randomly move very, very fast, and we can't predict where it is at any given time. What we can predict is if we were to take a snapshot of an electron, it would most likely be somewhere in this green region. And that would be the first 2 electrons. So if that atom, for example, was helium and it only has 2 electrons, those 2 electrons are very likely to be somewhere in that green area, that green spherical area outside the nucleus. That's the first energy level, but it's also called the 1s orbital, or I'm sorry, the 1s subshell, because and here, in fact, I think in this diagram, they call it the 1N. 1N means it's the first energy level and the S subshell. And the S subshell just means it's a spherical region around the nucleus where the first 2 electrons are likely to be located. So now let's change the color. So let's say that, go with blue. All right, so let's say that you have more than 2 electrons. So we'll go with something like sodium. Sodium has 11 electrons, okay? So the first 2 electrons are going to be within that green region, the 1s subshell, the first energy level S subshell. The next 2 electrons are going to be in the second energy level, which is this blue area, in that the second energy level has what's called an S subshell as well. It's just outside of the first energy level S subshell. And you can see it here. In this diagram, the 2NS subshell is the red region. The 1NS subshell is the blue region. So in the second energy level, the S subshell contains, again, 2 electrons. So we've got 2 electrons in the 1NS subshell, and we've got 2 electrons in the 2NS subshell. So that's 4 total. And how many did I tell you that sodium has? Sodium has 11 electrons. Okay, so far we've accounted for 2 electrons. So the second energy level also has p subshells that are shaped like dumbbells. And there are 6 of them. Well, really there are 3 of them because a dumbbell has 2 ends. So on the x-axis, you have this dumbbell shape here. And on the y-axis, you have this dumbbell shape. And then the z-axis, the same thing. And so on this one, I'm just going to draw one of the dumbbell shapes. But that region in that dumbbell shape is where the next 2 electrons reside. So for each of the p subshells, you have 2 more electrons. So you have a total of 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6 in the p subshells. So what that gives you in the second energy level is 8 electrons. Okay, so those subshells are just simply regions of space where if we were to take a snapshot of an electron at any given time, it will be somewhere in that area. It's likely to be somewhere in that dumbbell shape, for example, if it's in the one of the p subshells. So this is really tricky to understand. So I try to simplify it in biology by just saying that you need to understand electrons don't orbit the nucleus. They don't orbit the nucleus like planets orbit the sun. You need to understand electrons move randomly about the nucleus, but that electrons also reside in energy levels. And for our purposes, it's easier to just go back and simply say that the first energy level is stable with 2 electrons, and then the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh are stable with 8. So electrons will fill their energy levels until they're full, and then extra electrons will move to the next highest energy level. And they, instead of orbiting, they do randomly move about the nucleus of the atom. Now, this slide, you can watch this video if you'd like to. This is slide number 20. So we're going to go to 21. All right, and talk about chemical reactions, because chemical reactions occur in order that atoms can become stable, in order that so that atoms will fill their valence shells or their outer energy levels. In chemical reactions, you have reactants, and these are the substances that are present at the beginning of the reaction. In a recipe, we would call them ingredients. And then the products would be the substances that are present when the reaction is over. So these are the substances that are formed. Reactants are the substances that are used, like ingredients, and products are substances that are formed, like the cake or the cookie or whatever it is that you are, your recipe is causing you to create. So this is an example of a chemical reaction where a larger chemical breaks down, and this larger chemical, H2O2, or actually two molecules of H2O2, is hydrogen peroxide. You probably have this in your medicine cabinet. And if it has been sitting there for a while, it's really not hydrogen peroxide anymore. If it has been sitting there for several years, for example, it has probably already broken down into water, H2O, and oxygen gas. So it would be useless if you were to need the hydrogen peroxide, to sterilize a wound or something like that. The hydrogen peroxide reaction, where it breaks down into water and oxygen, is called an irreversible reaction. Once it happens, the water and the oxygen aren't going to recombine and form back into hydrogen peroxide. That is not going to happen. But there are reactions that are reversible. This is a very common example of a reaction that happens in the human body. In fact, the entire reaction is not shown here, and I'd like it better if it was. So I'm going to show you the whole picture here. Okay, so in the human body, there's an ion called bicarbonate, has a negative charge. And bicarbonate is something that is produced, that is secreted by the pancreas to neutralize stomach acid. And then there's another ion called hydrogen ion with a positive charge. And in body fluids, bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions can combine to form carbonic acid. And then that carbonic acid will split up into carbon dioxide and water. But the reverse reaction can also happen. Water and carbon dioxide can combine and form carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid can break up into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And we'll come back to this later, but this is a very important reaction in the human body. We may actually not talk about it much until Bio 112, but it is a very important chemical reaction that occurs in the human body to kind of help keep the pH of body fluids within a healthy range. So a chemical bond is defined as the attractive force that links atoms together to form molecules. So it's not a glue, it's not an adhesive, it's an attraction. It's a very, very strong attraction between atoms to form molecules. A very common chemical bond is the bond that forms between hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms. Well, two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, to be exact, to form water. So we know that hydrogen atoms have one valence electron because they only have one electron, period. And we know that oxygen atoms have 6 valence electrons. An oxygen atom has 8 electrons total, but the first 2 are in the first energy level, and they're not shown because all we're concerned about are the valence electrons, and oxygen has 6 valence electrons. So in order to become stable, hydrogen needs 2, and oxygen needs 8 in order to fill their valence shell. So what they do is they share. The hydrogen shares its electron with the oxygen, and the oxygen shares 2 electrons, one with each hydrogen, and that forms a covalent bond. When electrons are shared, it forms a covalent bond.